Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, there's a lot of advocates across the country who are taking notice of male survivors and their needs. So I'm really honored to be a part of this webinar today and to share what I have. This is a starting point for individuals to really have deeper discussions within their agencies and to let everybody know where I'm coming from. Just to start off with, I identify as a survivor myself. I've been a volunteer at a center. I've been an advocate at a center. I've been a counselor therapist at a center. And now I'm a trainer. So I've kind of gone across the spectrum here in Pennsylvania working with male survivorship, both on an individual and professional level. It's taken me a while to get to the point to be a trainer. And I'm not the best, I'm just me. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat box. As usual, we have to thank our funder, and our funding source for this is OVW, and they provide the funding for us to do this, so we want to thank them. That's the grant information. And then the very starting point for, before we get into this webinar, I'm going to do my best not to trigger anybody. However, the content of this webinar might be triggering. There might be some aspects that come up for you, and it's not just the trigger of, I'm hearing a sexual violence survivor story, but also the trigger of, did I do something wrong in the past? And I would like us all to kind of frame it, not that you've done something wrong in the past, but this is a growing experience, and now you know how to do something a little bit differently, or you have questions to go back and ask your agency and fellow staff members to really change your practice for the better. There's no judgment. So any questions that come up, please feel free to ask in the chat box. We're not going to question anybody out. We're not going to be like, Peter asked this question. We're going to just kind of throw it out there for us to discuss and have some conversation about. This is a learning experience, so we want it to be rich, and that's going to be only that way if you participate. So the very first question I have for everybody is, what role do you have in your agency? And if you could use the chat box to type that in, I'll give you a few minutes to give some answers. So you have advocate, executive director. What role do you have? Therapist, youth counselor advocates, dual agency advocates, directors, dual agencies, and looks like more advocates. So I'm glad we have a lot of advocates in here in this webinar right now, because this is designed for you. This is designed to help you go back to your agency and ask some questions and have some good conversations. And they're not meant to be done in a bubble. Your folks at the Coalition and myself, we can help as well in some of these conversations. So the goals of this webinar are two of them. We're going to be looking at the foundational work that needs to be done to work with male survivors and the outreach that needs to be done through a trauma-informed lens. This webinar, in 90 minutes, we're not going to cover every aspect of foundational work or outreach. It's more of the highlights and some thought-provoking questions for you. And you're going to be receiving, after this webinar, in about a month or two, there's an actual document that's being created about tips and techniques for working with male survivors and providing outreach. So that's coming your way. Feel free to take notes. This will be online for you, I found out. And if anybody has any questions about some of the questions that are on the slides, you can always contact me at the end. There'll be my contact information. So that's the goal of this webinar. So we're going to start right off with the foundational work. And the reason we start here is because there's a lot of it. Our agencies weren't built in a day. And when we start providing services to maybe new survivors and provide outreach, there's a lot of foundational work that needs to be done and filling in some of those gaps that we need. So what's everybody in the room, when you think of men, what images come to mind in the work that you do? You can just type it in the chat box again. So what images come to mind when you think of men? Blunt, defeated. Any other images that come to mind when you think of men? Unheard, reluctant. So it sounds like I'm talking to a room that's worked with some survivors, as well as there's like some concepts around tough. So there's like preconceived notions of what it means to be male in our society. And when we talk about male survivors, be aware that we're not just talking about those who were born male, but we're also talking about those who identify as male. And the lens that we see the world through often is what we see. I go back to my culture, and in my culture there's a proverb that says we don't see things the way they are, we see them as we are. And so often the work that we do, we're surrounded by stories of males as being offenders, and we're surrounded by stories of male victims falling into a class where they have their guards up, they have their shields up, they can't talk, there's no one to turn to, or they're young boys that are damaged now. That's the narrative that gets spread throughout a lot of the work that we do, that males are the offenders, and that if males are victims, they're either really, really tough and there's really unusual reaction to it, meaning anger or toughness, or they're young boys and they're kind of broken. And that's the way we see it because of the stories we hear from other survivors. So if we start taking that apart in trauma-informed, and that's a buzzword, I know. I go back to survivor-centered from my early days of the work, but if we start breaking it apart, what it means is we start looking at the whole person that comes in. And we start looking at the whole community that we're talking about, and that is of males. And to do that as an agency and as an individual, we need to have conversations with each other. And part of that conversation is about what's the makeup of our culture. And this is taking inventory of the board, staff, and volunteers. And now some of you might have already done this from my understanding, but really looking at the history of the organization, was it founded primarily by women and run by women for a long time? Does your agency have a specific cultural background? Is it primarily white women that work there? Do your volunteers all look the same? Do your volunteers all sound the same, come from the same background? Are they all college-age students? What type of events does your organization go out in the community? Are these primarily prevention events for males in your community? And so often what we see is that we have these events that go out in the community, and when you bring up males, it's talking about prevention of violence. What's the primary language of your materials? Is it primarily English? Who seeks employment and volunteering? Who serves in your board? What is the role of your board in your community? Those questions, when you start breaking those down and having a conversation, which I encourage you to do, to sit at a staff meeting and kind of break down those questions, it's not to place blame on the individuals who create our organizations, but to show a light of where we're at, taking stock. And that takes stock, when we take stock of that, be very aware that the survivors in your community know that. They see your agency. If you have a primarily female-run and white female-run agency, they see you as the white women's agency that only deals with women. If you have more history of domestic violence, then you're the battered women's shelter. So really taking stock of what that culture is, so that you have a starting point to really start opening your eyes into where we go with male survivors. The next aspect, and these are all the foundational, is your education. Does your agency have opportunities to practice skills and increase their skills? Practice and learn and increase their skills for working with male survivors. Your coalition has been putting out 2 years at least having a conference. That's great. But is it in your training manuals as a small section of working with male survivors, or do you have continually time periods to work on those skills and to build those skills working with male survivors? Here's where we start talking about the environment that you walk into. What do males see? This is where we need some partners. If you take nothing away from this, find partners in your community. And those partners to come in and do a walkthrough at your agency. They don't necessarily always have to be male. This is a great template for working with males, but you can spread to any culture. Have them do a walkthrough. Walk through your building. What posters do they see? What staff do they see? Who greets them? What's the website look like? What do your flyers look like? What do your brochures look like? Where's the building located? Just have all this information gathered by this walkthrough, and it really can help shape your services for male survivors. And we're going to talk more in depth about that. This is just the foundational aspects of questions to ask just to get the basic understanding. It's taking an assessment. And the next part is talking about how do we communicate and hear individual strengths. Pretty straightforward question. Our movement prides itself on that. We talk about the empowerment model and how we hear individual survivor stories and we build on the strengths. However, working with male survivors, in my experience over the last 2 decades, so often we're seeing individuals that have reached the end of their rope when they come into our agencies, and they've had all this preconceived baggage they bring along from other agencies. As you well know, there's a common myth of male survivors becoming offenders. I once had a male survivor come in who had seen other agencies, not for being a sexual violence victim, but for drug and alcohol treatment. And when he came in, he felt so defeated, and he was so fearful that he just had a child, that he was going to abuse that child. That's where he started off. He couldn't even speak of any strength, couldn't speak of anything other than that fear in him that was formalized in other agencies that constantly looked at him as being male and being tough. You have to stop doing drug and alcohol. That's just an excuse saying you're a victim. While you're afraid you're going to offend, they had counselors ask him and repeatedly quiz him on those questions, on being an offender, so that he had this fear just increased tenfold that when he came in, because he just had a child, that he was going to be an offender. So not only myself, but other staff and volunteers and the individuals in the hotline really had to brush up those skills of hearing the strengths, hearing the individual and how we communicate that and being open to it. So it meant asking more questions and being more present to hear those answers about the strengths and honoring those strengths. Well, you're coming in for services. It sounds like to me that you don't want to offend on your child. That's a really big strength to have. And opening up dialogue like that to give room for that strength to show through, so those fears could slip away. And that was difficult for some of our volunteers who had limited contact with male survivors. They focused in on, he's talking about being an offender, therefore he's going to be an offender, and they fed into that myth. So it really took a lot of our agency working together. And looking back in time, ideally, if I could have had conversations prior to this person coming in with the whole agency, it would have shifted a lot of the heartache that happened within our agency at the time, because it did create strife. Any questions about that right now? Okay, so we're going to move on into the awarenesses, which is leading into that. Does your organization have open-ended discussions? this is where you might find some sticking points in agencies. I've heard countless times individuals say, we serve everybody and we would love to help male survivors, but they just don't come in. I love it when I hear the statement because it means someone's being honest and genuine about where they're at. But if you start breaking it down, first off, there's a willingness, which I like. There's a willingness to see survivors. But they feel kind of torn down. They feel like that survivors aren't coming in. And there's a couple reasons for that. And they need to have some conversations. One, do their services meet the needs of male survivors? Are the services provided where the male survivors need them? And what is the culture like? Is it a safe place for them to come if they are perceived as always the villain? And that's why the picture's up there. That male survivors often get portrayed as a villain. And there's a lot of screening tools in agencies that are dual agencies that agencies use to keep out offenders of domestic violence that also get used against male survivors of sexual violence. So in the chat box, I'd like to know, just by typing in yes or no, how many agencies have screening tools right now to keep out offenders from their agency? One no, yes, no, couple, one yes, couple yeses, and a couple no's so far. So as everybody else types in, this is something I'd like you to have some discussions about within your agency, about do these screening tools only screen out offenders of domestic violence, or do they also screen out male survivors? And there's a question on what this would look like. Could you type in a little bit more of what you mean? What the screening tool would look like, or the conversation? I'm a little bit confused just now. Of the conversation. So the conversation would be, and later we're going to get into other conversations, how you bring out paperwork, but you bring the screening tool to your supervisor, or if you have open discussion staff meetings, and you bring the tool out. And then you break it down by, just to say, being very aware, well, this question is asked. Can you tell me where it comes from, who put it in there, what's the goal of this question? And you really start just going question by question in your screening tool individually and asking, does it serve a purpose? Does it actually achieve that purpose that it's supposed to serve? And then if there's not, a better question to ask. When you start going through that, the whole form, start looking at it for those sort of concepts. Does it meet the goal? Does it serve the goal? And is it still dated or relevant? Put that aside. After you get down to those notes, find a partner, male survivors, that are maybe volunteers or a TA provider. I'd be more than willing to look at it and give that survey with the edits done to the individual and say, how would you feel being asked these questions? Do you feel any of them put you off or shut you down? And then take that back to your agency and go, we've done these shifts, these first edits, this is some feedback we got, now how can we improve it? And that's a good way of having that conversation, because we don't want to make it become the person who created it be villainized, vilified for it. And that happens often within the agencies when you start going over forms or changing the way procedures are done. I hope that answers that. It's a slow conversation, it's not fast. And that really was going into a great question to go into the next aspect, is the language. So often the language within our agencies, our community as a movement is very stifling to male survivors. Even the concept of male survivors and male victims. So often I've worked with males that never saw themselves in either of those identities. And a lot of reasons for that, their cultures, their background. And so the language we use, we have to be very flexible. if I ask everybody in the room what is the sexual violence spectrum, I'm sure everybody would be able to tell me it's a spectrum of sexual violence. It's not an Olympics of crime. It can be anywhere from hazing and bullying to sexual harassment to sexual violence to rape to intimate partner violence to rape and homicide. Usually that's the answer you get, and that it intersects with all these crimes, and that's the way we talk about it. Male survivors sometimes don't even see themselves in that spectrum. An uncle touched me. A pervert did this to me. I was hazed. They don't see themselves reflected in that spectrum, so our language and the way we view it really becomes problematic. Also, the way states view the crime of sexual violence for male survivors sometimes can cause problems as well. So even our language is limiting for male survivors. So we keep it open. We ask open-ended questions. We ask open-ended questions about gender identity. We don't just say male means a certain biological makeup. We say that male identity means if you identify as male. So really thinking through language. And that's an ongoing conversation that all of our agencies have had, but it should just keep continuing, and we add in the concepts of male identity into it. And so that brings us to the intake forms and how we review them. Like we were talking about with the screening tool. Intake forms are, I always say they're kind of like, when I go to agencies, they're like a dinosaur dig. You find these intake forms that have been around for a very long time, and they may or may not have been reviewed recently. And sometimes we ask questions on them that just have no purpose. So really going question by question, what's the goal of this question? Is the goal met? Is there like a funding source that needs this question asked? Is it the best way to ask that question? Intake forms can be very, very daunting to survivors, period, but even more daunting to someone who doesn't see themselves as having a need met by your agency. So really thinking through how we do that and what those questions mean. And using gender inclusive nouns, not gender neutral nouns. And you have Michael Forge coming up there in June. I encourage you to go visit, to go to that conference. He's wonderful, but really take in the idea of what gender inclusive means versus gender neutral. And we're going to go on. So here's a big sticking point, the name of your organization. How many of your organizations, example of, there's a question. So examples of gender inclusive nouns. On many forms, it's Mr. or Mrs. and Ms. for the identifiers, and then do you identify as male or female? When you ask the questions of an either or, it really becomes exclusive. So instead of saying gender neutral and like right, just, I'm trying to think, I'm sorry, I'm stuttering. To be, I can think gender inclusive better because I always focus there. So instead of going male, female, you can write down male, female, preferred pronoun is male or female or other, and then you can write other and have an open space for them to write in that pronoun. So it's reforming the question to be inclusive instead of an either or checkbox. In those either or checkboxes, usually if it's gender neutral, it's he, she, them that gets written out. So really leaving opening for them to write in their own. So it's reforming that question for gender inclusive pronouns and asking for the pronoun that they identify with, not that they prefer. Because for me to ask you what pronoun you prefer is different than say what you identify with. Prefer means that it's just what I prefer, but you can do something different. Identifying with this means this is who I am, so it gives complete ownership over that. And Forge does great work around that, and we can put you in touch with them. And there are other individuals that do some great work, but Forge comes to mind the most right now. I hope that answers your question. So the next question I have for everybody, and thanks for asking so many questions, is how many of your organizations have a gender in the name of it, like the Women's Rape Crisis Center or the YWCA or the Women's Shelter? Just by a show of hands, yes or no, how many people have that in their name? No? One no. One no. Yes. No. So the individuals, as you keep going, that do have that in their name, it's not a game, it's not the end for seeing male survivors. It means you have to work a little bit harder at getting male survivors to see you and identify with you. That goes to the marketing and messaging, which we're going to next. But if there is a way to change your name, if there is a way to be more inclusive, please consider it as an agency. There was a center in my state that changed their name, I believe, to the Blackthorn Center. Very gendered, inclusive, didn't really, it's just a center there. When they did that, their caseload of male survivors increased threefold. They went from barely seeing any male survivors to increasing the number of male survivors to almost on par with the female survivors that came in. My agency, when it changed its name, my former agency, to just its acronym, SARC, it increased male survivorship so much so that my caseload was 75 to 80% any given month male survivors. And within a year, I would see on average 300 to 400 male survivors. And that's in small 2 rural counties. So really putting that out there to change the name. So as we go on with leaning towards the idea of what marketing and messaging we're going to do, there's just a few other areas that we have to think about. So we just went through the foundational kind of cultural aspects of looking at our agencies. The policies support that. So this is a huge thing. Our policies created to be the start of growth, or are they created to be rules that we are confined by? And what I mean by that is so often policies have been created in reaction to something, and it's done to protect the agency. But there are ways of developing policies that will create growth. And a good example of that is providing services outside in the community. So does your agency actually have policies about providing your services in the community? This is one that I cannot stress enough with working with male survivors, because if your name has women in it, or if your agency has historically been women-focused, males might not identify or might not feel comfortable coming to your agency. But providing services within the community really creates bridging that gap of being survivors where they're at. In some communities that you can go to that have large groups of males are veterans. I used to go to 2 VA hospitals. I used to go to prison settings. I used to go to drug and alcohol treatment facilities. Right there at those 3 different areas, beyond that and word of mouth, it increased my caseload. So I'd run groups in all these areas. But we needed to have policies around it. Our agency didn't have any policies. It was a very passive agency in the sense of survivors came to us. We didn't go to them. So really just kind of putting that in your hat and going back and checking your agency's policies about providing services in the community. Does your agency have any? And there's a question about, can women run a male group? I really like the way you're thinking, because you're like leading into all these different, the next slide. Yes, women can lead male groups, but I would also encourage mixed gender groups. I had mixed gender groups that ran very well, both those who identified male and those who identified as female in the room. They went very well because people could identify with a different experience and say, so women could identify and say, this male's in the room and I feel safe and I don't feel like I'm going to be assaulted, and they understand what I've been through. The males could be in the room and overcome some of their shame by seeing women and survivors, female survivors, not shame them or belittle them for not being able to protect themselves. And all of my groups I've always run always have two advocates. So a male and a female often was the way I ran groups because there wasn't any other male staff. Two women also ran my male groups in the VA in a drug and alcohol. The only problem we ran into was the prison setting. The prison, we didn't run groups for males in the prison. We did individual. In the prison setting that I worked at, they wouldn't allow females to come in and work with the males. So that was a problem. But that was how I got my job, too. My agency saw a need, and they filled it. So I hope that helps. And there's a lot of stuff I can do with group later with whoever would like to know about that. There's some tools coming out later this year about working with groups. Hopefully it will be done this year. So what type of services do you have for males? Do they look the same or do they look different? In my agency, we had the basic services, quote unquote. I use big bunny ears for that, basic. Hotline, one-on-one counseling, medical advocacy, which comprised ER visits, legal accompaniment, which comprised of going to court. That was the basic four that we had, then groups, but the groups were women groups at the time when I started. By the time I ended, we had other services. So I had one-on-one meetings that weren't therapy sessions with male survivors and female survivors in the community. So I had this one teen male who could not sit in a chair and talk about what he was going through. He needed to do something, so we played basketball together, and I can't even play basketball. But that was what I did for 90 minutes. I'd go out in the community, we'd play basketball, and he'd talk to me in a secure place. We also switched up, and we had meetings instead of groups, because groups seem to really push male survivors away when we advertised that, so we made it into meetings. We had a lot more expressive art activities. We had a lot more team building activities. We would do hiking, for example. We would take survivors for walks. We had a walking event. So there was all these different services that we would provide male survivors that we started adding on, and they always shift and change. And those services also went over to female survivors as well. And it just increased the amount of survivors that we saw because our services shifted and changed. We had long-term medical advocacy. We started going to dental appointments with survivors. So there was a lot of other things that my peers at my agency took up the challenge of creating new services. And that kind of leads me to when talking doesn't work. You know, this model of talk therapy doesn't always, quote unquote, work. And I'm using that again in parentheses, work, because the way that we've created therapy and therapy sessions as therapists so often has a very limited scope. You're in an office, you wait for them to come into you, which doesn't work if you have to go out in the community. So really shifting that up and what can we do for that in other models. I'm happy to say there are some other models being created right now with some research, but we don't have anything back yet. And this is the last thing before we go into the messaging. And I want to appreciate everybody staying so very intent on this webinar. Right now is the idea of the partnerships that we need to create. This goes into our messaging, but there's partnerships we need to create for our survivors as well as our staff. When you start this work within an agency and your agency starts moving forward and seeing more male survivors, it can be very triggering for staff members. So often our movement, we know a lot of survivors come into the movement to be workers. So often they're female. Often there are male offenders involved in that. So seeing male survivors come in can be very triggering. So how do we take care of our staff? Also, how do we take care of our individual male survivors that come in when they go beyond the scope of the services we provide? Meaning, do you know the individuals in your community that provide suicide support, and what is their knowledge of male survivorship? Do you know the drug and alcohol treatment facilities? Do you know what their view is on a survivor using drugs and alcohol to cope with pain versus they're an addict using survivorship as an excuse? Do your homeless shelters in your area have an ability to provide support for your male survivors and not be a scary place? So often some of the male survivors I saw struggled with homelessness. They were veterans, the ones that might come to mind right now. And homeless shelters are not safe places for males because they're usually open areas. There's beds too close to each other, and it triggers them all night long. And there's a lot of crime that happens. People steal from each other. So they're just not safe places. So what can you do to work with your homeless shelter to provide support for your male survivors? Can you provide shelter? And then your VA. How is your VA or your veterans affiliates that provide services to veterans, what's their avenue? That's just a few of the partners that you need to kind of start thinking about and how they provide mental wellness to your male survivors, because they'll touch into other systems. Not all male survivors will, but that's just some examples. So we have some time left, and we're going to start now on comprehensive messaging. This area is really important because I know a lot of individuals always ask, how do we get male survivors into our agency? How do we reach them? How do we do outreach? And often people want the pamphlet or the flyer that works. There is no pamphlet or flyer that works. You need a comprehensive messaging package within your agency. And that starts off with your community messaging. And this is something to evaluate again. Evaluate, do you support and go out in the community and have like Real Men Can Stop Rape? As a male survivor and as talking to other male survivors, Real Men Can Stop Rape, that messaging can cause problems for you if you're going through your healing process, because if you break it down as a survivor, if Real Men Can Stop Rape and you were raped, what's that mean about yourself? You've been less of a man, and you already feel like that for what you've gone through. So really thinking through what's your community messaging, and this means having partners. I would suggest having college students look at the last 5 to 10 years worth of news clippings that your agency has put out there and events to really look at the messaging you're putting out and start looking at the gaps for working with male survivors and thinking through what's the message you want. Across the country right now, people are waking up to male survivors, but is there some messaging you want to put out there that you're welcoming to male survivors, that you believe male survivors, that you're there for male survivors and they will be treated with respect? Thinking through that large message for the community. And then look at the policies you need around responding to reports of male survivors in the media. The Jerry Sandusky case happened in my state, and I was working as a local advocate. And I'm just putting out there the sensationalized manner in which the case started to break in our state was horrendous for male survivors. And there wasn't really a counterpoint in the early stages to help male survivors overcome the sensationalized nature and the feeding into myths that happened with that case. Now, the national organization, SCRC, did take up that role in PCAR later down the road, but I'm talking in the smaller papers. It just didn't happen. And there were a lot of opinion pieces put out there by individuals in the community that really shamed and blamed male survivors and accused them of being gay. So it was very hostile. So having a policy around how to respond is really important. And then your professional messages. What is the message you need to talk to these partners? So for example, if you're talking to a prison to try and get in there and do work for PREA and work with male survivors, the best lead-in question is, we're here to make your work easier, and you match up their goals. If they want a safe prison, then you can explain to them people are being less triggered, make a safer prison because you have less forms of violence and people feeling that they have to protect themselves. And then you fill in the blanks. This is what we can do as an agency. So being very targeted. Those pamphlets you create, being very targeted towards the professionals in the community or church groups. And then the survivor messaging. This is one point where I would suggest using survivor messages, finding survivors that are willing to speak, and that can be a national level, a local level, a state level, but finding male survivors who are willing to put their voice to your website, to give a comment or a quote to a paper. It's SAM, it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so really raising that awareness. I know the Huffington Post is going to be posting a blog of mine later this month. 1 in 6 is joining some blogs on Huffington Post. Going and finding those pieces and linking to them in your social media so survivors can see some sort of voice that sounds similar to them. Very, very important, which goes to review your online presence. Really looking at what your online presence looks like, what the content, and does it resonate, having that walkthrough from your online space. And this is where your state partners can most likely help. In all these conversations, what's the next steps is active listening to survivors, asking them when they come in, how was your experience, male survivors? What would you like to see? And being responsive. But these big conversations with your organization, you might need an outside mediator. You might need your state coalition to come in to help you with these questions and conversations. Or a national partner like myself, or 1 in 6, or Forge. But really walking the steps together by having these conversations. So we have a few minutes for dialogue, I think, if my timing was correct. So this is where if you have any questions, please type in the chat box.
Hey Eric, this is Naomi from Wakasa. I have a quick question. I was wondering if there were templates that, I know you talked a bit about policy changes, changes to your web page, things to make them more accessible to males. Are there examples of things that people have used that they've gotten feedback from male survivors that have worked? Exactly what Kathy just asked. In the text box as well, so some model policies that programs might be able to go off of.
Not yet. I would love to say that we have something right now readily packaged. We don't have it currently, but it's in the works. I know there are a few different entities right now in the process of creating those, and so I'm hoping within end of the year to early next year they will be there. But we don't have to wait for them to get their work done with the policies, for example. If you use a logical model of just taking your policies apart like you normally do, hopefully, like every so often, every 3 to 5 years, taking those policies and asking the questions about how does this work with male survivors, are there any other policies, and being very practical about that and having some partners look at them.
Okay.
Under that lens is really important. As far as the website goes, I know that by the end of this year there will be some sites that will have that public for you that I'll be able to publish personally. I also know that 1 in 6, which is your wonderful partners and our TA partners, their website, if you go and look at it, it's very helpful, and it will change the way you actually do your website for all survivors. But it's a very survivor-centered, focused website that doesn't exclude anybody.
Thank you. Yes.
So there's a question about 1 in 6. 1in6.org is the website. 1 1 in 6 is an organization that was created. I want to say David Lisek was on the founding board, Stephen Lepore, and a few other individuals. And they're male survivors. And this website, they're TA partners, so they provide technical assistance. And their website is broken down to 3 different areas. You can enter as a professional, someone who is a friend or family member of a male survivor, or a male survivor. 1 in 6 comes from the statistic of 1 in 6 boys will be sexually assaulted by 18, and to work with male survivors of child sexual abuse, adult survivors. So the website's broken down in different ways of entering into it, and then it has broken out into blogs, survivor-led areas, survivor-worded areas, as well as really kind of good resources and tools. They've done a lot of excellent work, 1 in 6, for working with adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Thank you. Great questions.
Eric, we had one question. How do you deal with the anger a male survivor may feel?
Okay. So I'm glad somebody went there. I was hoping somebody would go towards the emotions. I know that early on, my task was to talk about the outreach and the foundational aspects of doing that policies, but when you work with a survivor that might have anger, first thing that to think about is that anger is expressed in every family differently. I have a very unique ethnic background. There's some Jewish, there's some Irish, there's some, I think, maybe even French, and a couple other different things mixed in. So my family heritage, my mom's side was very loud in their anger. So they were very loud, screaming, hollering kind of individuals. My father's side, some of them were very quiet, never said a word. If they went silent, that was how they expressed their anger. So when you start working with survivors around anger, the very first thing to think about is what language of anger are they using? Because so often we've kind of gotten this cookie cutter mold, and as a movement that we're used to hearing an anger expressed about sexual violence almost like I'm an advocate, I have to go out there and fight for my rights. We're used to that sort of anger. But we're not used to maybe the loud screaming anger and cursing anger, or we're not used to the quiet anger that just stops and there's no response. So really understanding that there's different languages of anger, and then allowing room for it like we would with any other survivor, right? We would make room for that anger to come out, and we would be that transformational aspect in the room to help that anger convert into wherever that survivor needs it to go. It might need an action step for them to defend themselves, meaning not going home for family reunions, or it might be an action step of writing a letter to the editor. So really being there and staying with that anger. That's how my suggestion of working with anger has been in the past. Any other questions around working with anger, or does that answer your question? So I'll wait for that person to respond. I see there's another question about engaging teens, and I'm looking at the question now. So engaging male teens. Great question. The one thing I found in working with male teens is opening the dialogue at where they're at. So going to, so often you might be asked to come into a football team and talk to them about tasing or preventing sexual violence of women. I would go in and I would start off with, I know there's male survivors in this room that have been assaulted, so I would start off just like I start off any other discussion where I know there's survivors in the room, set that ground rules, a safe space, and then I would talk about it's not right to be hazed, it's not right to be bullied, and there's sexual violence that happens in that, and just kind of put that out there. And teens would start coming around and talking about that. Also, there were teen groups that I worked with that were mixed gender that were not formed by me, but I know the person who formed those groups with open invitation for everybody. So I'm having a hard time reading the questions, Peter, so on my screen.
So the person who asked about how to deal with anger of male survivor may feel followed up with, when they are cursing and venting, what should your response be? Cursing and venting, okay. So this goes back to the culture change in your organization that might, talking about language again. So sitting down with your coworkers and saying, what words can we hear and what words do we have difficulty hearing? And it sounds like some individuals might have problems hearing curse words. My rule of thumb is if you're not directing the curse words at me, meaning I'm the target of these curse words, then I can hear whatever you have to say. Because every swear word you might have said just about that offender or about how you feel about that offender, I have no right to sugarcoat it or ask you to change those words or ask you to somehow make it in my dialect of what anger feels like. If that's the words you know, it may be the only words you know to use to express that emotion. We are not always taught as males to use our heart sense words. I'm a therapist, so I use those words in passing. I can use them like, my anger right now is over blah, blah, blah. But if I'm in my survivorship back in the day and going through it and I was coming forward, I would throw the F-bomb around. I'm not going to do it in this webinar, but I would throw the F-bomb around because I was angry and I would state it. But that was the words I used. I had a very wise advocate who sat there and said, okay, in their mind, you know, like, you're not directing at me. And I would say, that sounds like blah, blah, blah. You're extremely angry. You have every right to be angry. No one had the right to do that to you. The same things we do with female survivors. It's just a matter of being in a space where we can hear that, people's raised voices. And this comes back to that triggering that might happen for your staff and find that outside support. So I would suggest having supervision with a therapist, maybe a community partner come in once a month, talk to your staff about how hearing male survivor stories affects them, and maybe having some ongoing conversations to provide that support, because it might trigger you. But through those triggers, you'll have a lot of growth. I hope that answers your question. And then response of a good generic response for someone's anger is, I'm here to listen to you and for you to share whatever you need. And then if you start repeating it, not repeating the same words, but you kind of paraphrase it back. Or you ask questions if you don't know what words mean. I've worked with clients now that have gone to college and I don't know their slang anymore. So when they start telling me some sort of slang, I have to ask it, even though they're cursing. I'd be like, not right in the middle and interrupt, but after they get done, I'd be like, I don't know what you were talking about. Can you share what that means? That alone in a conversation shifts the focus. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody for taking part in this. I know I have an hour, and it looks like we're right at an hour. So I just want to say thank you for letting me be a part of this webinar.
Yeah, and thanks, Eric, for joining us. And is it okay if people emailed you if they thought of questions after the webinar is over? Is that also okay?
Definitely.
Or would you rather? Okay.
Yeah,
so it looks like you Yeah, your contact information is all there. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Friends, so email me. And there are a lot of publications coming out in the future, and I'm lucky enough to be here at the National Center, so I know of them in the process of or where they're at. So even if you have a question about something in particular like the policies, email me, and I have some stuff maybe in rough draft form I can send you and say, hey, this hasn't been approved or anything, but here's some ideas and starting points just to provide that response for you so that you have something there to work with.